All right, well, thank you everyone for coming, both in person and online here. The interesting stuff. We have a great lineup of speakers here talking about all fun things about paper, and I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say about how they're incorporating paper materiality into their research and all the fun things you can do with that. The couple of housekeeping things, will be taking questions just in the chat. So if you have a question, just type it up in the chat and it'll come to me. I'm Dave Weimer, your humble host, and I will share those with the speakers. And then if people have questions here, I'll put them in the chat so you can hear them. We'll have all four speakers go and then take questions as a group. And so I'll just introduce our four speakers now, and then we'll go kind of in the order that seems most organic, probably who's closest to the chair at any one moment. Tech crisis averted. So our speakers in alphabetical order, but probably not in speaking order. So Jen Bervin is an artist and poet with a multidisciplinary practice. She joins text and textile elements and joined and situated poetics to create complex, elegant work. Her conceptual, scientific, and literary investigations of material history result from long-term research and collaboration with artists and specialists ranging from literary scholars to material scientists. And if you haven't seen her amazing book on Emily Dickinson's material objects, I definitely encourage you to check that out. Deidre Lynch, our next, another one of our four speakers, is the Ernest Birnbaum Professor of English Literature and Harvard College Professor. Her most recent book is The Unfinished Book from Oxford University Press and co-edited with Alexandra Gillespie. And she's currently finishing a book titled Paper Slips, Assembling and Remaking the Book. Our third among our four speakers is Nora Rosegarten. And she is a doctoral student in the history of art and architecture at Harvard. She's interested in how print as technology, as heuristic, as epistemology, as mediator, structured and has long structured experiences in the world. She configures printmaking broadly to encompass processes of making, cultures of materials, and the production of meaning at and across registers of physical operations. Prior to Harvard, Nora received a BA from Georgetown and an MA from Williams College. And then Karina Zeltzman is an assistant professor at Princeton. She is the author of Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing and Politics in 19th Century Mexico from the University of California Press, which received the Howard F. Klein Book Prize in Mexican History from the Latin American Studies Association. Trained as a letterpress printer and a maker of clamshell boxes. She is a senior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. And I will also note that a co-sponsor of this event is the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. And I also like to thank Deborah Mayer and Kelly Kraszewski from the Weissman Preservation Center for all that they've done to show us some great paper samples in person here today, and think about all the interesting stuff that comes out of that. So without further ado, our first speaker is going to be Deidre. And so I will pull up her slides here. And then
those are not my beautiful.
No, they're not your. This is not my beautiful house.
There it is. Not my slides are not so beautiful. Nope. Oh, there it is. Good. Okay.
That's not good. All Sorry, there seems to be something happening here.
Why don't you disable the waiting room so that you don't keep getting pop-ups of people?
Well, I'm going to do it over here. All right. They should. I don't know why it's.
Are people not able to see the slides? Is that the
It'll just
issue?
leave. This is what they're saying over here.
Oh, okay, well, so I don't think there's a way around this. This is what
Yeah.
happened at the talk I was telling you about last week.
I apologize.
So there's
for
no
the,
punchlines. Everything
there's
is given,
no
going to be given
secrets,
away.
no
No
secrets.
secrets.
So here's the
Okay, all right. So, thank you all for coming. This is my first hybrid event, and I don't know where to put my eyes. So if I look disconcerted, that would be the reason. My paper has a title. It's not a great title. It's Making Paper Present. And I'll begin by observing that paper making was essential to the history of print and to the development of print culture. But today I want to ponder the fact that this relationship has not been and perhaps cannot be reciprocal. I'm going to be talking about the difficulties that paper historians have confronted in the effort to document paper's history by means of printed texts, difficulties that those using digital platforms haven't been able to resolve either. In my comments, I'm going first to draw on a printed novel, and then second, show you in my slides a few books pieced together by would-be paper historians from the 18th and 19th centuries. With this mixture of book types, I hope to provoke a discussion of the very different sorts of literacies that these artifacts elicit from those who handle them. So let me start with the novel, Lost Illusions, Illusions Perdues. It was published serially by Honoré de Balzac between 1837 and 1843, though its action is set about a decade and a half earlier. Near the beginning of his novel, Balzac has his readers listen in on one of the strangest marriage proposal scenes in all of 19th century literature, which has quite a few of them. Lost Illusions is remembered for the story of Lucien de Rubempré, the would-be poet who in the novel's first part travels from the French provinces to Paris, where conforming to a familiar storyline, his dreams of love and poetry dissipate rapidly. Appalled by metropolitan manners and by what he discovers about the money-grubbing crassness of the book trade, Lucien abandons poetry and becomes a cynical, amoral journalist. This summary, however, overlooks how Balzac arranges for this story to be doubled by another. Part one, which he titles Two Poets, also starts unspooling the story of David Séchard. David is Lucien's fast friend and soulmate, as the distinctly queer image from this illustrated edition indicates. And early on in the novel, by virtue of the efficacy of the courtship scene that I turn to now, David becomes Lucien's brother-in-law. David works as a printer in Angoulême in Normandy, following an apprenticeship in Paris with the real-life firm of Didot. He is also a student of chemistry, and he wins Lucien's sister's heart by confessing to his own dreams of glory, scientific rather than literary. David believes himself to be on the verge of creating an important industrial invention. If he is the first in the field, it will win him a fortune. As he explains to Eve, the supply of linen rags, from which in the 1820s paper continues to be crafted, has long since ceased to keep up with the demand for printed matter, a problem that will ultimately hold back the expansion that David expects to see in the publishing trade, and from which Lucien will profit in the novel's next part. However, David believes, as he announces, that as a paper maker, he can succeed in finding out a way of manufacturing paper that will eliminate the need for linen. Here, the narrator intervenes into the dialogue, thus in Kathleen Rainey's translation. In reply to a question from the young girl, David gave her an account of paper manufacture that will not be out of place in a work that owes its concrete existence no less to the existence of paper than to the printing press, But this long digression between the lover and his mistress had better be abridged. Balzac's narrator then delivers in one paragraph a high-speed history of papermaking that begins in late 8th century China and arrives at the end of the paragraph at early 19th century France. I'm going to do some abridging now, and I turn to tell you about what David says next when the narrator permits him to resume his monologuing. David, it appears, directs considerable contempt toward the use of cotton rags in papermaking, which is becoming the norm in England especially. The books produced from this have become less durable, just as cotton clothing is less durable than linen clothing. Cotton paper tears and creases easily. And what is worse, it is so soluble that a book made of cotton paper will turn to pulp in a quarter of an hour if it is left standing in water. You'll have the same treatment to an old book, by contrast, and it will remain readable. The shift is a problem of the greatest importance, David insists, for literature and science, as well as economics. What a disgrace for our times if we produce books that will not last, David exclaims to his beloved. But through a chance encounter he had in Paris with a book from China, he has begun to catch sight of a potential solution, the possibility of crafting paper, as in China, where the paper has always been lighter, finer, and also stronger than in France, from some vegetable matter, perhaps not bamboo or mulberry as there, but perhaps artichokes or straw instead. And in France, such paper could be made by machine. Just as this strange love tryst is interrupted by the return of Lucien, who has been visiting the town's poor approximation of a literary salon, David outlines a vision of the future. Machinery solves the problem of production at a low cost that in China is solved by cheap labor. If we can succeed in finding a cheap way of manufacturing paper of a quality comparable to the Chinese, the weight and size of books could be reduced by at least half. A set of Voltaire, which weighs 200
Apologize everyone for what has just happened, which is that my computer is doing something strange. So, all right. Wonder, no. Yes, okay. That computer has died as far as I can tell. So we're changing to a new computer. And it's going to take me a second to get Deidre's slides, which I can do. You just wanted to build suspense.
I guess so, yeah. Sabrina. Oh my God, do you have to download them again? Oh. Yeah, that's what I don't know.
Okay, so put all the people indeed. All right. Where were we?
That's the right slide. Nope, that's the wrong slide.
All right.
Okay. Oh. Okay, so I'm back. And I'm still talking because David Séchard also goes on and on, though he's supposed to be courting this young woman. I'm still talking about the advantages of Chinese paper. And he says to Eve, If we can succeed in finding a way of a cheap way of manufacturing paper of a quality comparable to the Chinese, the weight and size of books could be reduced by at least half. A set of Voltaire, which weighs 250 pounds, printed on our woven papers, would weigh less than 50 on Chinese paper. And that would be a triumph indeed. The space available in libraries will be a growing problem in a period when everything is becoming smaller, men as well as things, and houses in particular. And I'll cut off his monologuing there. There's a lot to be said about this vision, about Chinese paper, about the particular terms in which Balzac envisions the future of the book. But I hasten to the losses that conclude Lost Illusions. David Séchard's glorious vision comes to naught. Those of you who know that part 3 of Lost Illusions is titled The Inventor's Sufferings, Les Souffrances de l'Inventeur, will have guessed as much. Just after Lucien de Rubempré in Paris crashes and burns and returns disgraced to his native town, Balzac carries his readers back to the pursuit of scientific glory and a fortune that has been consuming the second of the 2 poets that he identified in part 1. In part 3, we learn that David Séchard has been carrying on his experiments on plant
I'm sorry, everyone. I'm now on my phone because I've literally had 2 computers die on me in the course of 30 minutes. So Deidre is going to.
Right, but what
sign
is
into
the
her
meeting?
computer.
Where is the meeting?
So this is the ID. So if you go to Zoom and just go to
Meeting.
home
Home.
and join
Join and
and then type in 997
997
3129
3129
7993.
7993. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Connect to audio. Join.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, sorry, hold on.
And now we have weird echoes
Can you just
too.
mute yours for a second? Okay.
Okay, so if this makes you feel any better, Balzac's novel was originally serialized, so his audience also experienced this suspense. You need to turn off your phone, right? That's why the echo is there. Okay, so now kind of share screen, right? Okay. Oh no, I don't have a dongle.
No, it's okay.
Is it? Is that gonna work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
I'm not actually. No, that's not true. Okay, Dave, because I'm panicking, I'm having trouble finding my slideshow. Oh,
Everything is, yeah.
okay. I don't think that's going to share the slideshow
No, no.
yet.
So if you here.
Yeah, sorry.
Which one were you on?
I was on number, no, up, 5. 5, there, 5, yep.
All right, 3rd time's a charm here.
So as I was saying, or as David was saying to Eve, oh no, I wasn't, I'm sorry, I've totally lost my place now. All right, so in part 3 of the novel, where kind of all of the allusions are going to be lost, we find out that David has had to carry out these experiments with vegetable-based papers in secret because his, I don't know why I just got this message, Dave. I've been signed out.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Is she still on the Zoom? Okay. Yeah. All right.
Okay. So go back to share screen.
Yeah.
That's not the adjective that I was going to use. Okay, so part 3, things are going very wrong for David. Yes, me too. I'm relating so much. He's having to do his experiments with various vegetables and reeds in secret because he's hiding from the creditors who, because his brother-in-law has written a bad check aimed to put him in and used, forged his brother-in-law's signature. His creditors want to put him into prison. And because, as Balzac explains, the discovery of a method of manufacturing a cheap paper was not the whole story, David has also been slowed down in this phase of his enterprise by his perfectionist desire to find out a process for sizing the paper, glazing it in effect so as to reduce its absorbency while it still remains in the pulping trough. Nonetheless, we learn that the letters that David sends to Eve from his hiding place and which he writes upon his samples were, I quote, some of them of metallic purity, others as soft as Chinese paper, and offering all the nuances of possible nuances of white. And that was not the slide you were meant to be seeing, but for some reason the slides aren't moving now. I'm not in the slideshow. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm there we go. So in this section, we're also looking on, we readers, as David's crazed miserly father also tries out the paper samples that his son has finally managed to create out of pulp made from artichokes and from the reeds and nettles growing on the outskirts of town. Falling back into the habits of his former life, old Séchard, who though illiterate has been a printer in his day as well, puts his tongue to the samples, for from his earliest youth he had used his palate as a test for paper. Practicing a kind of weaver's handshake, old Séchard also felt the samples between his finger and thumb, creased them, folded them, and tested them in every way known to typographers who are accustomed to examining samples of paper and judging their quality. And I want to make a simple point here. When we read a copy of Lost Illusions, or at least when we read this text from the platform of the printed book, we are handling paper too. And yet I would conjecture that since 1843, few readers encountering this passage have been tempted to do as old Séchard does, and taste and touch and crease and test the paper. Novel reading demands a different sort of literacy than the one illustrated in this episode. The novel reader understands paper to be the near invisible substrate to meaning and value, not a carrier of meaning and value in and of itself. We look at the words, not at the surface on which they're imprinted. And yet, in 1843, readers engaging with the final part of Lost Illusions in its serialized form in the newspaper, who did attend to the physical medium of the novel, would have been positioned to foretell with some exactitude the final fate of David's dreams of glory. In the end, he is disillusioned too, most of all because he loses his control over his inventions. Rival printers in Angoulême relieved David from the debts with which Lucien has saddled him by buying up the rights to his invention and then adapting it. Whereas he had been searching out a way to size paper in the vat, the plant-based paper that they, with some chicanery, appropriate from David is instead unsized, which means that it is not paper that can be used for bookmaking or as writing paper, but it is instead a spin-off newsprint. It is the very stuff, that is, on which the serialized final part of Lost Illusions would appear in 1843. As the media theorist Lothar Müller has noted, in the novel's closing pages, Balzac registers a signal development in the history of paper. For centuries, newspapers had shared their carrier medium with books and letters, but by 1843, the formats diverged. Balzac registers that development, but readers of his novel in 1843 might not have grasped the ways in which it had been made literally, palpably present to them. As the paper historian Jonathan Senchen observes in his 2020 book, The Intimacy of Paper, the technical and social codes of reading dictate that normally substrates should recede from view. Paper makes books, but it is actually very difficult to get into books in its own right, into books as visible, tangible, tasteable, and testable, interesting stuff. Now, in my last few concluding minutes, and I know I've gone way over time, I want to turn to books assembled in the century before Lost Illusions by people who aim to pursue just that project of putting paper into books, books put together by real-life equivalents to David Séchard, who likewise hoped to perfect technology for making paper from sources other than rags, and who used the codex form to show off the specimens they produced in the course of that endeavor. And books likewise containing paper samples that were put together by historians of the book at a moment when that particular mode of inquiry was just being consolidated. These books were generally created with the express aim either of cultivating or of celebrating printing's reach and uniformity. As one spokesman for the quasi-evangelicalism of such accounts of the dissemination of the word, consider a certain Matthias Koop, who was the author in 1800 of historical account of the substances which have been used to describe events and to convey ideas from the earliest date to the invention of paper. This is a volume describing ancient equivalents to paper and commenting on Koop's own efforts to produce paper from sources other than rags. And it's a volume that, not incidentally, is printed on paper manufactured solely from straw. In his dedication to the king, Koop asserts that it is well known that in dark and barbarous ages, the inhabitants of no country have ever made any progress towards improvement in civilization without the use of writing, print, and paper. What is curious about the books that are made in support of this cause of improvement in civilization, though, is that put together with cut and paste methods, showcasing mounted samples and specimens that appeal to the sense of touch as well as to the eye, they are much closer to scrapbooks than they are to the uniform printed publications that they tout. I have of late been studying 18th and 19th century scrapbooks whose makers, mostly female, make them sites for the collection and collaging of paper scraps, often Chinese paper scraps, in fact. So this resemblance delights me. I think here of Jakob Christian Schaffer, who titled the magnificent 6-volume work that he published in Regensburg in the 1760s, in my bad translation from German, Attempts and Patterns for Making Paper Without Rags or Only with a Small Addition of Rags. The paper historian Dard Hunter says that a complete set of this book, and I'm not sure that the Houghton's is complete, will contain 95 specimens of paper, 2 examples of paper lace, 4 samples of paper cloth, and among its mounted specimens, a complete set of Schaffer's book should also contain 1 sample that is remarkable as the first documented sample of paper produced from wood pulp. The group of bookmakers I'm thinking of also includes from early 18th century England, one John Bagford, who stockpiled evidence for a projected general history of printing and therefore accumulated not only, as Joseph Ames in a later 18th century attempt to inventory his stock said, portfolios containing the printed title pages, frontispieces, headpieces, tailpieces, initial letters, rebuses, heads, maps, and various prints and ornaments of books in 26 volumes. But he also accumulated a portfolio with variety of marbled paper, a portfolio with Chinese, etc., writing and paper, and a portfolio with different sorts of paper and paper marks and printed cases relating to the duties thereon. Whitney Tretian, in her wonderful account of Bagford, is a bit more detailed. Bagford collected samples of paper, marbled paper, colored papers, wallpapers, embroidery designs, tracing paper, tissue paper, brown paper, rice paper, pasteboard, as well as ephemera related to paper, including ream wrappers. As Tretian, whose slides I have borrowed, also makes clear, for all Bagford's interest in print's powers of duplication, his own materials resisted and thwarted reproduction. And so you can't tell what his paper collection is like from my slides. You have to visit the British Library to see and also touch them. Indeed, Tretian says that it was critical to Bagford's method that the specimen was original and not a facsimile or a copy. To record paper's history, he has to showcase paper's varying materiality, the specific fibrous structure created by various modes of manufacture. But this meant that his paper history was at cross purposes with the general history of printing that was his official occupation, in some sense, fatally so. Paper was no longer a medium, no longer just a medium when considered in this light. I return to my opening comment about the conundrums created by the effort to document paper histories in printed texts, albeit from opposite angles. The scrapbook-like books I've just been showing you and Balzac's printed novel highlight the same friction. They demonstrate that a commitment to what Jonathan Senchen, drawing on Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, calls paper's presence effects, is in direct variance with a commitment to paper as a facilitator of what Gumbrecht calls meaning effects, and a commitment to paper as the agents of those effects diffusion. And that's the end. And I've never been so happy to get through a slideshow in my life. And now how do you want to do this?
You stop sharing mute and down this one.
Okay, I will stop sharing. Oh, come on, pay attention. I'm gonna let you do it. Stop, escape, there. There. Okay. I don't usually drink at 2 in the afternoon, but.
Thank you, Deidre. I'm sure all the other presenters are glad they did not go first. Karina is brave enough to go. You should be able to use it here.
Okay. One here.
I'm going to basically mirror you for this on here. Anyway, so next is Karina, and
Where do I talk? Here? Okay. 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 I'm so glad I got to hear somebody else.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Dave, for organizing this and heroically troubleshooting us through. And thank you so much to everyone for this great, for the morning session. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I am a historian, so I have a slightly different method to tackling some of similar questions to Deirdre's about how people, the relation between printed sources for understanding paper history. And I'm also using printed sources to talk about paper history in a very different way. This is a very new project for me, so introducing some really fresh things that I'm still working through. And I want to start by actually talking about just an object, the imprint actually on a government report. And this is an image of the title page from this report, which has this lengthy title explaining the purpose of this report, which was prepared by Mexico's Bureau of Agriculture and Industry. And the purpose was to update the government on the state of agriculture and industry in the Mexican Republic in 1844. And when I first viewed this document, I was immediately struck by its elaborate presentation. The title page has this illustration of a neoclassical allegorical figure surrounded by these symbols of abundance and progress. And this is very atypical for a kind of government document at the time from 19th century Mexico. And I was super interested to see that the report's publisher explicitly references the materiality in the imprint, which is also unusual. There's laws in Mexico that required printers to actually, state the name and the location on all of their works, but the printer here went beyond and informs his audiences that the report had been printed on Mexican paper. So when I stumbled across this, I asked myself, why did the printer think it was necessary to convey this extra information to readers? Why did the paper's provenance matter at all? And my very brief talk tries to answer or begin to answer this question. And to do so, I ended up diving into these debates about economic development, trade policy, which all kind of revealed some of the ways that paper was enmeshed in political debates in 19th century Mexico. So if you actually read this report, the text offers one possible answer to the question of why you need to tell people where the paper comes from. And inside the report, the director of this Bureau of Agricultural and Industry presents this sobering, cautiously optimistic kind of appraisal of agriculture and industry in Mexico. It's been 20 years, just to orient you in space and time, it's been 20 years since Mexico's independence. And in the interim, government officials are really struggling to jumpstart the economy. The mining sector had been debilitated by the wars of independence. Local markets were flooding with manufacturers, especially textiles from abroad. Spanish merchants had withdrawn their capital that had previously financed local manufacturing. So early Republican governments are trying desperately to figure out ways to kind of recover from those changes. There had been projects to create like an economic development bank, which had kind of fallen apart by the 1830s. And at this time, by the 1840s, you have gradually kind of several manufacturing sectors beginning to chug along, including this very new papermaking industry. Now, according to this report, which was the director is a very influential conservative statesman, a man named Lucas Alemán. In his report, he reports that 4 paper mills were operating in the outskirts of Mexico City. And in the appendix, there are a couple new projects emerging in the cities of Puebla and the region of Jalisco. Despite what he called serious setbacks and misfortunes that were related to this immense startup costs of actually opening a paper mill and the lack of technical knowledge to run the paper mill, they were gradually entering production. And at the same time, shortages of raw materials and sometimes water were constantly threatening to undermine the viability of these projects. Quote, only a constant and positive protection will make it possible to recuperate the great expense spent in the first mills developed, Alemán argues. And he urged the government to sort of support the paper industry with the continuing of tariff protections and tariff exemptions on the importation of raw materials. So in light of the report's text, the decision to use domestically made paper and tell readers about this were obviously sort of strategically designed to highlight milestones, right, on what Alemán hoped would become this gradual but steady path towards Mexico's industrialization. And despite the challenges confronting this emerging paper industry, it could already produce a material that was worthy of some kind of a serious government document, right? Officials could read about the progress of national industry, and they could see and feel it for themselves in the form of Mexican paper. If we zoom out to the broader political context in which this report was issued, however, there's a second kind of reading that we can make of this imprint. The decision to proclaim paper's Mexican origins was also a way to link this report to a political debate that was ongoing in the press, which journalists identified as the question of the day, right? La cuestión del día. A debate that had erupted the previous year in 1844 in reaction to the government's protectionist policies towards this emerging paper industry. Let me provide a little bit of context. Mexican lawmakers had created this system of protectionist tariffs to support the growth of a domestic paper industry in the 1830s. And tariffs on paper varied according to the paper type, revealing, the multiplicity of things people use paper for, or how people sort of talked about or thought about paper from a kind of lawmaker perspective. You have fancy decorative papers, wallpaper, lined ledger paper, which are consumed by elites and businesses, were taxed at the highest rates, whereas sandpaper, rough brown wrapping paper, printing paper, which served as inputs into other kind of productive and commercial processes, have lower rates. It's actually kind of hard to calculate the rate per piece, because there were taxed at a different way than they were sold. So I'm still working on trying to figure out that problem. But paper makers, cited these tariffs as really important for helping them to compete in the face of competition from, US and European papermaking sources. But among the sectors that depended on paper, printers emerged as really vocal critics of these protectionist policies. This was an artisanal group in the 1840s that was also emerging and on the rise in Mexico. This is a decade where the number of urban presses grew, the size of newspapers doubled, the first daily newspapers are consolidating in Mexico. And if you just put aside like all of the capital that you would need to invest in equipping a printing business, paper was the largest share of printers' production costs, right, in the early Republican era, much more so than labor or other kinds of materials. So printers generally use a specific type of paper, this PBD, right, unsized paper, or papel sin cola or sin encolar. And this is the paper that doesn't have sizing, the sort of gelatin that's added to writing paper after production, which reduces its water absorbing properties and facilitates the application of writing ink onto a dry surface. But in the 1840s, printers still dampen their paper, so it would receive the sticky printing ink. So I think what we've kind of determined, and maybe this needs some tweaking, is that sizing was unnecessary or maybe counterproductive from a printer's perspective. So lawmakers sort of knew about these whole kind of categories of paper, and they recognized unsized paper as this kind of specific class and taxed it at a lower rate than sized writing paper. But printers took advantage of this kind of broader conversation that was going on about protectionism to try to get rid of taxes on their specific kind of paper altogether. And they seized their moment in 1844 when there was this big kind of lobbying effort by various sectors to rewrite tax policy in Mexico's sort of external tax policies. And while Congress is starting to think about this overhaul, printers begin this campaign to abolish taxes on imported unsized paper. And the rejection of local paper starts with this printer named Ignacio Cumplido, who is a publisher, very prominent printer who owns and runs the moderate liberal daily called El Siglo XIX, the 19th century. From the perspective of El Siglo, paper was super important for the nation's growing printing trades, but this combination of scarcity and what he thought of as the paper makers' monopolistic power threatened to undermine progress by inflating the cost of paper artificially, thus making books and printed matter prohibitively expensive for Mexicans. And the author of this editorial explains that, or claims that, the manufacturers in the paper sector need stimulus. Their paper is very expensive and not abundant. The best way to make it cheaper and more abundant is to force them to enter into competition with foreign paper. Now, actors within the government pushed back against El Siglo's analysis of the paper question, and they sort of contributed to this cacophony of perspectives that were finding expression in the press. And I started collecting, the cuestión del día, the cuestión del papel, all of the sort of framings of this debate from various sides. Now, the director of the Government Bureau of Agriculture and Industry, Lucas Alemán, was the first to kind of counter printers' arguments. And he agreed that the backwardness of the printing industry was, quote, the greatest obstacle for the progress of industry. But rather than blame paper makers, he sort of redefined the issue in relation to the entire productive economy of print. The real reason for high costs in Mexico, he argued, was printers' high wages. Because Mexico's print markets were small, compositors' labor costs were distributed among relatively small print runs, in contrast to foreign publications, which he argues are printed in much larger numbers, so the labor, would be cheaper per piece. And so, printed works in Mexico, he argued, would always be expensive, quote, as long as the population of the Republic is not large enough as is necessary to sell large editions, which are the only ones that can be cheap. So by identifying wages and small print markets as the major stumbling block for lowering the cost of printed works, Aleman sort of redirects the conversation away from printers' complaints about the high cost of materials and towards a defense of industry and capital. And besides, the considerable amount of capital that already had been invested in the paper industry, Aleman claimed that it generated much needed employment for agricultural sectors and for the rural poor. Farmers had started to grow pita de maguey, which is agave, specifically to provision the paper industry, while what he called the most unhappy classes had begun to collect rags, which he described as a quite productive activity. His report kind of cast this paper-making industry as essential to a broad swath of Mexican society and urged lawmakers not to ruin industrialization plans, quote, upon which enlightened and patriotic Mexicans found their future hopes for the nation by caving into printers' self-interested demands. So the debates reveal kind of competing analysis of paper's relationship to these big categories like enlightenment, progress, backwardness. For Aleman, papermaking had the power to uplift the Mexican nation, including its poorest residents. For Cumplido, the printer who sort of fired back at Aleman in the press, paper was essentially this lowly, insignificant raw material that only gained transcendence through printing, which he described as, quote, the most powerful driver of enlightenment and knowledge. To prioritize papermaking over printing was to sort of stand the basic principles of creativity on their head, to subordinate the architect to the bricklayer, to the painter, or even the brush maker, the kind of hierarchy that the printer kind of calls up, right, to counter the papermaking lobby. And a group of 50 printers concurred. They band together to protest the tariffs and petition Congress. Mexico City's lithographers joined in with a scathing critique of local paper, which they dismissed as useless because it was uneven and full of sandy particles. And it sort of ruined the quality of the impression. And then you had other government actors who defended tariffs with sort of strange immaterial arguments that I won't get into here, but also very pragmatic solutions saying that, to eliminate tariffs on just printing paper would be impossible because it would encourage fraud at the ports. Merchants would start to interleave sized and unsized paper into a single ream, and it would be impossible to, verify with the stroke of a pen, every single piece of paper for the appropriate tax. So paper itself also becomes part of the political transcript, right, which soon moved to the halls of Congress. Lawmakers submitted competing samples as evidence in support of their positions in the tariff debate, demonstrating either the capacity or the failure of national producers. Placed in this context, Aleman's 1845 report, with its printed on Mexican paper imprint, reads not only as an argument in favor of industry, but also as a kind of last word that thumbed its nose at printers' free trade arguments. Because this year, in 1845, paper makers and their supporters had already won the argument, and they managed to retain protective tariffs in the legislation. So the debates reveal some of the ways that paper generated political controversy in post-independence Mexico. Though you would never know it if you only read the text of these kinds of government reports that emphasize the progress of industry, the paper question mobilized a cross-section of urban society, revealing competing analyses of paper's role in the new nation and differences on how best to harness its productive power. Far from settled, these debates would actually continue throughout the 19th century, resurfacing every 20 years or so as printers and their allies continued to reject domestic paper. Their lobbying efforts actually culminate about 80 years later in the creation of a state-run newsprint monopoly that would import and distribute printing paper for newspapers all around Mexico. However, far from resolving the paper question, you can imagine how a switch to a state-run paper monopoly might generate new forms of political debate. But that's a story for another. Thanks, everybody.
No hitches. No hitches. DJ deserves all the water. All right. Who is next? All right. Next will be Nora.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today with my fellow panelists and such an honor. Thank you so much to Dave for organizing and for the wonderful morning of interacting with paper, which is really the best part of being an art historian. What I'm going to present today is just a small taste of my nascent dissertation project, which explores the material history and physical philosophies of inkless emboss in 20th century and contemporary American art. Sheets of paper float across the wall. Viewed from afar, their surfaces shimmer and shift mirage-like. Upon moving closer, the viewer sees a familiar format, the newspaper cover, replete with title, date, and columns of winding text. Empty boxes indicate where images might have corresponded to particular news items. The urge to touch the works, to reach out an arm and graze their surfaces with fingertips is powerful. Each unit of language rises up from the sheet toward the viewer as if initiating a haptic connection. This dimensionality enacts a profoundly strange reading experience. While the bold all caps headlines are clearly legible, the smaller lines and columns of text rumble confusedly beneath them. With effort, one who would read this text could make it out, but the material conditions of the piece deny easy access to semantic meaning. In other words, the text is somewhat beside the point. The eye is denied primacy in this encounter, which produces discomfort and intensifies the desire to enact other forms of knowing, like touch. These are a few works from artist Bethany Joy Collins's series, The Birmingham News 1963, which she began in 2016. Collins's practice explores the connections between race, language, and materiality across time. In the Birmingham News series shown here, Collins returned to front pages of that periodical from April of 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized nonviolent protests, demonstrations, and voter registration drives in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, against ongoing racism and segregation. Collins noticed that these Birmingham demonstrations, and especially police arrests and violence against demonstrators, were rarely reported in the city's newspaper, despite the events of these weeks dominating the national news media. Collins decided to draw attention to this omission by reprinting those same front pages without ink. On this slide, you see the original cover of the Birmingham News at left, paired with Collins's translation at right. Here is a second example, this one dated to April 12, 1963, the day Dr. King and at least 55 other demonstrators were arrested during a nonviolent action against segregation. Dr. King would go on to write the letter from Birmingham jail during the next few days. Collins meets the white news media's refusal to acknowledge the Birmingham campaign with a material resistance that at once lays bare the omission and corrects for that omission affectively. Though the language itself is unchanged, its essence has been transmuted from an assertion of untruth into a relic of loss, absence, and embodied histories. In Collins's words, quote, "I'm interested in the ability of the residue to retain the text's essence in changed form, to be the same, but wholly different," end quote. In Collins's re-rendering, the text registers as at once ephemeral, ghostly, fading, something felt, not seen, and at the same time bears a striking visual resemblance to methods of relief sculpture or carving, like what one would see on a prominent building's edifice. Paper is crucial in producing this visual effect of both malleability and utter stasis. A material of paradoxical talents, paper is at once fragile and malleable, sensitive and shockingly strong, delicate and durable. Collins told me that she chose to work with paper for this project because it is skin-like. Paper, in her words, holds its wounds. This impulse then to reach out and touch the sheets in front of us is no accident. An uninked, rippling surface invites us to meet it, skin to skin, reorienting the encounter with a newspaper sheet from one of consumption, comprehension, and crumpled edges into a different sort of tactile experience. This text is the result of a printmaking technique called emboss, which I define as when a planar surface is manipulated under pressure to create raised and/or lowered areas. Emboss has a long and rich history, one which moves between practices of making among media, like sculpture and print, and across hierarchies of fine art and decoration. You have undoubtedly encountered emboss in your everyday life, on a notary stamp perhaps, or an elegant sheet of letter writing stationery, or even across the surface of your debit card. Collins's decision to use emboss alone and no ink gives her works their particular affective, sensory, and optical effects. In fact, the very lack of ink which entreats the sense of touch, transmuting the seemingly flat newspaper surface into a rumbling ocean of activity, functions at the same time to confound the eyes. This shift away from sight may be uncomfortable. Collins has said that in these works she sought to, quote, redirect the frustration of the text back onto the viewer, making the front page of the Birmingham News as painful to read as it should be, or even as it would be, if it bore its lies and bias openly. Discomfort draws the viewer into the sight of a problem, but it also indicates the viability of other routes, other ways of knowing, of learning, of doing. In fact, it is not just that Collins printed the sheet without ink. The front page of the Birmingham News appears as if the layer of ink articulating these letters had been peeled away, leaving in its wake a turbulent and unwieldy mass of illegible but assertively present graphic signifiers. This material proposition has wide-ranging and tantalizing implications, which I truly can only tease here, namely that printed materials may contain, in actuality or imagination, ghost versions of themselves rendered in emboss. The printmaker Ed Ruscha played with this idea when, in the year 2011, he reimagined his iconic standard station screen print in inkless emboss. What then does an awareness of the emboss underneath grant us? And how does this awareness inform an understanding of the Birmingham News series? As Jennifer Roberts has argued, quote, printmaking generates meaning at the level of fundamental physical operations, end quote. How then do we characterize the physical operations at play in Collins's prints? What historical precedents and material genealogies do these works open out on? And how do these embedded knowledges of making and also unmaking impact us as viewers? One possible route opened up by Collins's exploration of emboss is the history of newspaper printing. Collins's sheets of embossed paper are reminiscent formally with a strange and little remembered printing relic called the flong. Flongs are temporary molds made of a form of set type used in newspaper printing to enable mass production. Flongs, like the ones shown here, were invented to streamline the arduous process of wrangling movable type. To make a book using movable type, the printer would have to assemble each individual letter by hand, selecting from a stack of metal pieces like these. This person also worked in reverse, since, as the printed areas at the bottom show, the relief process creates a mirror image. Once this type was assembled, it was then secured in printing armature. And this is how newspapers were printed for many, many years. As you can imagine, this process was complicated and drawn out. A tremendous amount of labor was required to hand compose every page. But most of all, these pages had to be printed on flat presses. And by the late 19th century, much speedier presses had been invented, many of them relying on cylindrical rather than planar designs. However, these forms were a big problem. They were too solid to be bent into different shapes. The flong was one piece of a response to this problem. After the printer had arranged all the letterpress pieces and locked them into place, they would then use several sheets of dampened tissue paper to make an impression of the text. This mold was called the flong. Here you see someone pulling back a flong away from a sheet of letterpress. The dried flong would then be used to make a metal cast called a stereotype of that letterpress. Here we see the chamber for casting the flong. Since flongs were made of paper, flexible, durable, strong, delicate, they could be bent into a cylindrical orientation. And here we see a cylindrical stereotype, that's that metal plate that results from the flong, being processed by someone working at the New York Times in 1953. Due to their fragility and their intermediary step in the process of printing, relatively few flongs survive. What emerges from readings of Collins's The Birmingham News in dialogue with flongs and the longer history of newspaper production. The flong, a crucial yet forgotten mediator, reminds the viewer that things did not have to be this way. letterpress language loses its ineffable, miraculous luster and the seeming authority of inevitability which these qualities invoke. The text did not always have to be as it was. The flong returns the viewer to a temporal and material moment when the text of the newspaper was uncertain, in flux and eminently changeable, translated from material to material by touch alone. This brings to mind Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's articulation of what she called, quote, the profoundly painful, profoundly relieving, and ethically crucial possibilities that the past in turn could have happened differently from the way that it actually did, which forms a complex relation to temporality that at once burrows backward and forward. Situating the Birmingham News within a material genealogy of paper does not obviate or relieve the problems these works highlight. However, attention to these evocative material histories and their deployments in contemporary artistic practices can draw attention to the contingencies of history, to the ways that processes of making always convey a bit of themselves along with their intended messages. In Collins' hands, this burrowing backward and forward incites and invites the impulse to touch, not merely to feel the wounds of the past, but to intervene, to act anew, to remake across a substrate of powerful and delicate paper. This affinity between Collins's artworks and the flong is exciting, but it's also limited. There are crucial differences between the flong and Collins's inkless emboss, most of all an inversion. Where the flong is recessed with letters pressed in, the Birmingham News is letters pressed out from their substrate. Paper's powerful capacity for molding and holding functions differently in these two sheets of paper, deployed to very different ends. Drawing these objects into dialogue with one another does not produce an easy equation, but is rather indicative of the complex ways material histories are transmitted and transmuted, how stories of process may be traced to offer associations and points of contact through reversal and inversion. After the 2016 election, Collins returned to the same covers of the Birmingham News, but for this subsequent printing, she took a different tack. She printed on dark gray archival newspaper, for one, but she also applied pressure to the prints not once as she had in the earlier iterations, but twice. That is, after running the paper and the mold through the press one time, she then ran it through again. Her goal was to work the paper to its limits, with each application of pressure functioning as the press of history. Collins told me that at the time, she felt as though history was repeating itself, and this double pressing was a mode for expressing that repetition materially. These works appear aged and worn. Unlike their predecessors, they seem to have spent decades exposed to the elements. Reading is impeded not just by the optical resistance of emboss, but by gaps and fissures, which open up across the substrate. Rather than encountering a planar surface riven with dimensionality, Collins shows us a surface already full of dips and gaps and angles, a surface in the process of being undone. Under pressure, the paper cracked and caved and warped, but as before, it held onto its shapes, its wounds. In these iterations of the Birmingham News, Collins modeled two disparate approaches to research with paper. As is so often the case, contemporary artists like Collins have their fingers on the very pulse of material capabilities. In fact, Collins's artwork draws our fingers, the viewer's finger, onto the heartbeat of paper, its poetics, its politics, its power. And it is in this tension between pressure and decay that paper emerges as the protagonist, capable of bearing and showing and feeling a remarkable range of emotive states, a material whose history only deepens our understanding of Collins's work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was great. We have Durban is our last speaker. Hopefully our luck continues to hold.
Hello, everyone. Fantastic morning. I had the great pleasure of seeing so many people I admire so greatly in one room, and who have been part of the thinking and development of something that's really still in its very nascent state. So Jennifer Roberts, Christine Jacobson, Deborah Meyer,
Nora Rosengarten, you're really thought partners in what I'm sure to be quite inarticulate about in the coming slides. I'm just going to read a little bit and then I'll just kind of abridge. In my research-based practice, I create large-scale sewn works and artist books combining text and textiles to contemplate closely Dickinson's irreducibly complex variant poetic systems. The American poet Emily Dickinson's textual practice has been obscured by more than a century of editorial interventions at this point, and my work draws from the array of posthumously omitted, redacted, and occluded aspects of Dickinson's poetry and manuscript production. Through concepts of repair, I'm invested in the possibilities and responsibilities embedded in taking women's artists seriously in the terms they set forth. So a particularly deep obsession of mine are Dickinson's variants. They're these tiny crosses that appear before the word souls, world, and then selves and sun are an extension of that variant. And it's a way to read flexibly, or I wouldn't say interchangeably, but words are constellating to one another. So you would read into that single line, in dying tis as if our souls absconded suddenly, world would take the place of souls. And in this case, relevant to what I've been thinking about the word sun, which is frequently a variant in Dickinson's manuscripts. And this project is loosely called Measuring the Sun, which comes from her work. During the 2 decades, roughly, of working closely with Dickinson's manuscripts, I've been literally moving the needle through sewn variant composites and the Dickinson composites, which is ongoing and expanding from the original 6 large sewn works to 30. So I'm doing fascicles 30 through 40 now. And collaborative publications like Gorgeous Nothings with Marta Werner and Christine Bergen, and later Susan Howe, to shift scholarly and public perceptions. In the lively, often prickly, divided field of Dickinson scholarship, I try to make emotionally compelling works that move conversations elsewhere, works that question and think in new paradigms. In the structure of a work, I try to signal how being contextual and in relation holds meaning. I want to hold space for what's present and absent, the seen and the unseen on the page, in culture and history. I value the ecologies of kinship, of queerness, the situated poetics of language and material intelligence. Stemming from 7 years of international silk research in collaboration with material scientists in silk poems, I'm asking questions about the material history and culture of the surfaces and supports that Dickinson used. The architecture of the page, what is seen and unseen, what is overlooked in plain sight, what is felt, draws my attention. I identify most with the margins and spine of a book, where a hand presses and smooths, where touch holds open and supports its possibilities. These tactile, nearly invisible, stamped embossed images in the upper left-hand corner of Dickinson's fascicle folio pages are ubiquitous throughout Dickinson's fascicles. And while there is ample scholarship linking American watermarks to handmade paper mill histories through 1830, these embossed stamped images on machine-made stationery folios have no such finding aid to correlate images to mills or dates of production within that sort of 50-year window when they are in circulation. They're only used on cotton and linen rag paper, to my knowledge. And I'm trying to trace these supports through the timelines of technological innovation in the 19th century through machine-made papers with the aid of the impeccable scholarship of Kathleen A. Baker's book, From the Hand to the Machine, 19th Century American Paper and Mediums, and Judith A. McGaw's Most Wonderful Machine Mechanization and Social Change in Berkshire Papermaking. McGaw points to women's industrial labor histories in the rag sorting rooms of mill paper mills where women sliced apart cotton and linen garments. I'll come back to that later. These can be for questions. Where women sliced apart cotton and linen garments, excised seams, fasteners, and soiled spots, and sent remaining fragments to be pulped and beaten for paper. Women staffed the paper mill finishing rooms. They checked quality, counted paper, added rules by machine, folded paper, and hand-fed folios between the stamped embossing dies. They also published writings, and archival and correspondence has been archived from textile and paper mills in the Berkshires and the Connecticut Valley in what is dubbed mill girl writings. You'll notice in these images from the Crane Museum of Papermaking that they don't change that much over the course of the span in which they're being photographed. The setup is the same. They're always populated by women, and there's usually one man standing and overseeing the work. So the sort of gender divisions within the paper making community don't change much. I'm particularly interested in how these embosses got on the paper, and through Kathleen Baker have learned that they were actually hand-fed into the machine by a woman employee, and that the folded folio was inserted. So you see the emboss through, basically 4 planar surfaces. And what's fun now, looking outside of the Dickinson archive, is that you see a lot of kind of misprints happening as well in that hand feeding process. So I'm researching in a number of archives right now. Primarily, I've been working at Houghton, at Amherst College, at the Crane Papermaking Museum, but I have sort of lists in multiple archives that I want to be able to get to. Currently, the finding aid for the embossments on Dickinson's fascicles is from 1996, and while wonderful, it's a bit dated, and so I think some initial images were commissioned by Leslie Morris at Houghton, by Deborah Mayer, and I am so thrilled to see the results and have been sort of trying to emulate the process. So I'll walk you through some of her images. And she also photographed her setup in a meticulous way. So I've been able to cut mats and bring lights and work in similar ways. So these are early tests, which I'll just show but not discuss too much. And thankfully, when Jennifer Roberts and I were at Houghton, Christine provided the setup for us so we could play with it. And really, to see an embossment, you have to just kind of circumambulate it. It's like a solar process in and of itself to actually see it. And I've found, after visiting a number of archives, that having that transmitted light underneath really helps you see the paper as well. So there are so many ways to see something that's hard to see. I love that image, Deborah. But she's meticulous so that you can see all of the information about how she's done what she's done and within the image itself. So this is why it needs to be done professionally. I love these. This is a view from Amherst College Library. So every archive I've worked in has these embossing stamps too. And every library has, sort of a repertoire of stamps that they've used. This is at Amherst Library, but it's been a book that they got from the Perkins Library for the Blind. It's also been electrotyped. I mean, there are just all of these layers of stamping. And forgive me, some of these things I'm just putting in to be in conversation with these are notes for its future conversations too. But also, some of the ones that I showed you at first are very legible, but a lot of these markings are not. They're like, like lumps of clay. And there's a very strange sort of abstraction that occurs when you're looking at them closely, when you can almost no longer see what they are. And so you'll take a photograph and you'll hold that away and try to see it, or kind of adjust your settings. So it's a sort of toggling between technologies to try to even see them. This is one of Dickinson's mangled manuscripts that was done, the mutilating process was done posthumously probably by a family member. I'm interested in the way a lot of these images carry empire with them in their heraldry and their eagles and their assertions. This is the back. I'm interested in the way the backs stutter and morph and sort of fall apart. But in a very concrete way, what I actually want to do, the thing that I actually want to accomplish right now is I want to be able to take every emboss in the fascicles and tether it to a specific mill in the Berkshires, in the Connecticut Valley, or wherever it came from. And this is in large part because Dickinson was writing and creating her works in the 19th century during the age of paper. So, you know, similarly to paper making in Mexico, the Berkshires was boom time. It was like 5 mills to 50 in a year, and exponential that way. So the sort of demand for paper as a material, but also the demand for rags to make the paper was at high ebb. I think it's not unlike right now building materials and supply chains with the pandemic. It's needed. And I find that the image of the rag picker to be misleading, because if you look at the paper mill records, there are like thousands of bales of textile scraps coming internationally to feed the mills. So it's not a small scale gathering effort at this point in the 19th century when it's machine. But I'm also interested in the ways that Dickinson is working around and with these embossments, when words touch them, when they don't, what comes close, what doesn't. And I'm interested in the ways that they do and don't match up. They promise symmetry, and sometimes the bottom die has nothing to do with the top. It's sort of like my waffle maker I was explaining that doesn't align. And I find that really interesting, and also quite, I don't know how to say it, but kind of personal. Like if I see this somewhere, I'll know it, you know. In another manuscript, it'll be easy to recognize the relationship between that very specific paper. So Carson's Congress is a paper she uses often. And what I'm learning is that Congress is a type of paper. Probably many of you already know that. But I first encountered Congress in a book by Polly Longsworth, where she includes a Dickinson embossment that she had annotated. This is for me, a very problematic one. It's a letter Dickinson sends to her brother Austin in 1853, when her father has been elected to Congress. And there's an annotation about member from the 10th, and it's a kind of cartoonish drawing of a quote unquote Indian walking into the Capitol. So there's I think there are a lot of problematics around this that are to be looked at much deeper. And I think Mike Kelly at Amherst is doing that particular research. So, but as I said, the signs of empire and the relationships, especially to the empire of cotton, are everywhere in these very kind of missable marks. And I'm interested in bringing that forward because cotton rag in artistic circles is seen as a good thing, but I find the word rag really problematic in the way that I find the word scraps problematic for Dickinson's late fragments. And rag in another context also is a musical term. To rag, rag is a noun, it's a verb, and ragtime is a category of music. And I'm interested in the relationship between these rags and that rag in particular. So I like to think interdisciplinarily through some of this. So these are images from the Crane Paper Museum. And it's been good for me to get outside of Dickinson. So these are images that she's using. These embossments appear in her fascicles too, but these are from the Crane archive. It's good for me to get outside of the archive to see how other people are using the same paper, not only to trace it, and to see other examples of watermarks. And I believe that the papers are actually printed sort of concave up, and sometimes they're folded backwards. So sometimes you have the sort of the divot side on the outside, and that's when you know that the writer has manipulated the paper for some reason. They also photograph in reverse. There's a really wonderful essay that a friend Nora gave me on death masks. And it's true, when you hit these with raking light, it's sometimes hard to see what's up and what's down. It really plays with your visual perception. And as I go through, I can't help but start to think about these surfaces in expanded ways. So it was a bit of a joke where I said I would never make paper, I would never weave. I've already started weaving. And then Marta Werner, who is a collaborator and quite brilliant, wanted to do something with the pins. I said, no, I would never do something with pins. And it's not looking like that. So, we'll probably be in conversation about that soon. But it is really literally a way of binding most things at that point. And in some ways, I'm surprised Dickinson didn't pin bind her fascicles instead of sew them for that reason. There's a Thoreau manuscript at New York Public Library that I saw on Monday, where he's annotating his sightings of particular plants chronologically, May through November in the woods. And it's bound with 2 pins at the side. And he's kept it for 5 years in a folded configuration. And it looks like there's nothing on it. And on the last page, there's an embossment. But if you ask where they are, they're really hard to find. If you search for emboss, as we can verify, you don't find them. It's really like, it is in some ways the delight of the library to go looking for them, because you're neither guaranteed success nor denied the wonders of the surprises of a library. So I've been looking at clues like this to see in what order things happen too. So here you can see that the emboss has been applied before the printing. And I have a suspicion, but I haven't confirmed it, that some embosses were added by paper sellers later, or stationers. I haven't seen that yet, but this particular stationery from Boston has caught my eye. T. Groom and Co. His array of stationery materials sent to the Cranes, it was like mouth-wateringly nice. He also has a colored emboss, which is something that you see much later. So this must be late 1800s. And then there are these sort of chance finds. So this is in the Theodore Award correspondence. I think it's from Mary Landis, one of the last people living in the Evergreens at the Dickinson's house. Just this very kind of crisp find in the middle of things. I wasn't looking for embosses at that point, but there they were. And so this is the Evergreens at Amherst. There's their chop. All right, I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was very delightful. We have technically no time for questions, but hopefully we can stay on for a little while. If anyone needs to leave here or remotely, by all means, we need to do. What questions? Thoughts? Concerns? That anyone has?
I'm having trouble hearing you, so you asking for questions?
Yeah.
I'm really confused as to how Bethany Joy Collins produces the matrix for those pages.
I have I'll try to keep it brief. It's a little bit complicated, but essentially she's taking a large sheet of acrylic and she's using a laser engraver. And so she's carving, and so she collaborates with actually a graphic designer who works with her to remove all the images and to essentially like recover these fonts, because a lot of the type is not maybe as uniform as you would think it is. So they collaborate rediscovering the fonts, and then she carves it into this sheet of acrylic, wets her paper, places the paper on the matrix, and they go through the press together so that the paper is forced into those depressions. And
She's not working from a photo of an original page from the newspaper at all.
she is initially, yes.
She is initially.
Yes.
And then she carves from.
She lays down kind of a map to guide her carving essentially,
Okay.
but she doesn't use the original newspaper for that.
She does, no, of course not, but she does, she hand carves all the letters.
Yes, all by
Thank you very
hand.
much.
No,
They're-
absolutely.
They're really wonderful.
They're amazing. And she does every single letter by hand in all of them. It's remarkable.
So I'm going to ask you. I guess in my mind, I was thinking 1953, it would have been an offset of that newspaper. Something, a disconnect for me, and so I'm asking you about that.
So you have discovered something that I had not, because I really wanted to figure out how the Birmingham News was doing their printing at the time. And they were relying on letterpress at that point, but I don't 100% know about the Flong situation. But actually, I mean, letterpress was used to print newspapers well into the 20th century. I mean, that image from the New York Times is from 1953. So, I mean, offset lithography is useful, but the Flong process really makes casting stereotypes affordable, and you can really make a lot of copies that way.
Yeah, line of. Yeah, I would imagine.
Yes, I'm sorry. I mean, that. Excuse me. Sure.
I thought we were looking at long. I don't think that's long, and when you put them two together, can you just talk a little bit more about the significance for her of having the, with long in the paper, and otherwise they look so similar, and so it seems like the whole significance by that in a way.
Definitely, yeah. I'm actually really informed by Jen's presentation, because Jen was talking about the way that depending on how you light emboss, it can look inverted or extruded. Like it's really actually sometimes quite difficult. So I had a very similar response. I asked the artist about Flongs, and she said that was not all she was thinking of. So there's no like artistic intentionality, but I do think that there's a relationship to be had between these methods where paper is so integral to how language is communicated and affect is communicated. And I think I'm not 100% like the relationship between the Flong and between her works. I'm still like working that out in some ways, but I do think that there's much to be learned about why her works affect us the way that they do from these objects that were made just to be in contact with other surfaces and to transmit language through that kind of touch that is not about sight, that is not about smell, that is not about taste, but just about pure contact.
I was going to say, there's such a strong sense in those column pieces of an energy coming from behind the person. The way you follow that, talk a little bit more about how you see the directionality of energy.
Yes, I think that sense that like if you fold, I mean, that's why the Flong image of pulling it back is so evocative to me, because when I stand before Collins's work, I feel as though if I were to rip it back, you would have like there would be something underneath. There's such a powerful sense of a presence. And for me, that is one of the powers of emboss, is that it's this kind of mediating structure that is capable of registering things on sort of both sides, so to speak. And that dorsal side, the presence of that is at one and the same time like uncanny, and I think also really comforting. Like there's someone on the other side that you're talking to. You're not alone in this encounter. Thank you so much.
One question I had, which is kind of for Deidre and Corinna, which is how, so, you have like a lot of content that's interested in the production of paper. I guess like how, with Balzac, or with the books and pamphlets you're encountering, kind of how that actually plays out in what's there. Like I mean, I know Corinna, you're still looking for this, right? Like how, when they're talking about Mexican paper, what does it actually, like, does what's in front of you actually match up with what they're describing? Or like in the Balzac, there's all this talk of production, and like what's the paper of Balzac's novels like? You know what I mean?
If I speak from here,
No, but I can come over to you.
I mean, kind of that's almost, I have to go so fast at the end. Because I felt so guilty about taking up so much time, but that's almost the punchline, right? It's that kind of David's invention is sold to people who kind of don't care about quality paper, and therefore kind of are going to use it for exactly the newsprint that the novel is being published on, because it was published in the newspapers. So there's this, I mean, first, obviously, it kind of attains a book form. So, I mean, in some ways, like he has to have been in on that joke from the start, but how successful kind of he was in communicating to readers that the stuff that they were reading about was also the stuff that they were touching, is precisely the question that is obsessing me, because I think those are two very different sorts of literacies, so that you're not conscious when you're the whole point of a novel is that you're not going to be conscious of the paper that you're handling. Even a novel that, as we were talking about at lunch, is maybe not as absorbing in the psychological sense as we might like it to be. So I think kind of in some ways, Balzac foresees your question, but kind of that coincidence of meaning and matter is sort of has been incidental to the history of that novel. So yeah. You wanna...
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The degree to which this is really like a discursive conversation where materiality is just like one ammunition in like a broader, like a sort of, or like a, in like a political debate, or if it ultimately is about, kind of economic interests, vying for, expression. And I wonder, I mean, there's a sort of degree to which the actors that I was reading about are sort of trying to educate, to kind of convince people that you should understand the quality of the things that you're reading, like that you should be able to kind of know and understand, and that it matters. I don't know if this is sort of like early precursor to ideas of, like these concepts of like how everything we have has a label in it, right? Made in something, and that is somehow really important to, I actually don't know the genealogy of that practice, if it's like related to like trade, labor practices or trade laws or what, or taste making, you know what I mean? Or like kind of cultural geographies of status associated with consuming objects. And yeah, to figure out like what
the paper actually is, you know, in the 19th century. I'm looking at this as a, like, I definitely want, you know, like a chapter in this project to be about the kind of debates about it and how people understand what was Mexican paper kind of as a concept. If that was a category that was sort of recognizable as such, but also like what was Mexican paper, which, you know, we were talking about upstairs a little bit, like how figuring out some kind of methodology for sampling, you know, how do you pick a sort of representative sample from the known quantity of objects out there to kind of be able to answer that question, and what are the best methods for doing so?
Yeah.
TBD. Sorry, I feel like I'm addressing you and the Zoom and not everyone in the room. The hybrid dilemma, anyways.
About when we're sort of fighting with frames the debate as the paper makers being the bricklayers, and the bricklayers, like, and then the architects being subject to the bricklayers, right? It's paper versus the printers. Then you spend so much time with manuscripts, and things on stationery. What if you
That's such a complex question. That's really great. Well, I mean, with Dickinson, manuscripts are a very particular issue because that's how we have her work from her lifetime for the most part. And her manuscripts are incredibly complicated. They do things that print doesn't do. And so, you know, within the Dickinson debates, which are lively, as I mentioned, you know, I think it kind of falls into a couple camps where there are the manuscript, like physicality people, and then there are the print people who prefer like a more traditional scholarly approach. And the more those conversations happen, the messier and the better it gets. And I feel like that's kind of where we are. I feel like I came of age in a similar time in poetry where that started to happen. And so I'm excited for how that's moving forward. But it was interesting, you know, like I said, I'm really like just at the very beginnings of this. And for people on Zoom who don't know my work, it takes a lot of layers for me to build up a project. So, you know, Silk Poems was 7 years, and this is year 1 of this. So I'm just asking very simple questions right now. But one thing that I noticed in the correspondence at Crane is that the mills are collaborating with each other. And so they're actually sharing employees, particularly like female employees saying, I need a finisher. This person is fairly old and has to stay home, but I can send you someone younger who you can train. You know, for example, like there's a sort of circulation of employees mill to mill that I found surprising. And also the material circuits between rags and paper early on in machine-made paper were different. There, you could trade rags to get paper at a certain point, and with the development of circularity, the dandy roll, which is sort of the screen writ round, it's fast. It's much faster. And my theory about the embossments, there was sort of this heartbreak moment for me at Crane when I got to the 1880s, and I was like, okay, is there going to be a photograph? Is there going to be a photograph? And I realized the embossments are kind of out of the picture by the 1880s. Mm-hmm. So they, like, photography and embossments do not touch as far as I can tell. Or that sort of that desire to photograph inside of a factory and share it outwardly doesn't align. But I think that having one person hand stamping also didn't align with commercial practices. And so they tried to put the sort of the fanciness into the dandy roll. So that's when the watermark comes back in vogue, I think, because it can be mechanized, whereas the embossment can. And all of those jobs that women had in the mills were finishing jobs that machines couldn't do well enough until the 20th century. As far as the relationship between printers and paper makers, I do not know. I'm deeper into the stationer conversation with the paper mills right now, in part because the stationers have such good taste. And I also am a great lover of paper, paper things. But what all this is driving at is I'm trying to make the connection in Dickinson's work between the paper, the textile, and practices of enslavement and expropriation. I mean, it's like America writ in a very small surface. And I want to be able to hold that along with holding the manuscript in conversation. And not to say that Dickinson is holding that, but to say in 2022, I should be holding that. So it's also a conversation about whiteness in a way.
We got one question. So I'm going to read the question in the chat for everyone here. It's thanks to all the speakers, and this is for Jen as well. In your research, what sort of traces of evidence have emerged which might attest to Dickinson's more direct relationship with the embosses? Fascinating how you spoke about her text moving around with them. Is there a sense of how she was employing the emboss in the material construct of her poem?
I think to answer that, Susan Howe has written about that early on in a number of her books. And I think Marta Warner touches on it on her new book, Master Hours as well. But I'm interested kind of in a more artist-like way in how she's working with her materials. I mean, I believe in the intelligence of the maker in navigating those spaces, which is not always an agreed upon viewpoint. And like particularly in that image, I kind of flew by of the really fabulous embossment and the postage stamp with the sort of winged collage coming out of the George Sand, Alone and in a Circumstance. You can see all these online. Like that, I feel like that gesture of adding the stamp to that particular manuscript had a lot to do with the embossment that was there. I mean, you can, at least I feel like she's playing with the form, she's seeing it. And in problematic ways too, so it's a ambiguous conversation that I'm interested in.
Yeah, so I for a vote. And then I read the book with you get something in the box a couple months ago, and one of the most amazing things is, of course, that the machine would very crisply emboss the top sheets, the several pieces of it at once, and the commodity would often be the sort of like the embossing kind of a lump. You couldn't read the letters, it no longer held the kind of symbolic value that it would have in the top of the sheet as it went in. And for me, what's most interesting about both of your talks is that there's some point in the process of embossing where you get an impression that it somehow crossed the line from legible, from the world of symbolic printing, reproduction, communication back into what's just like the vault. I mean, those sort of uncertain blobby ones that you showed, Jen, it looked like the paper was getting repulped. It was returning to its base material work that it's in. And it just struck me that for both of you, that state is the, you might think of it kind of, I don't know, example of the moment when Phaedra's conflict between matter and meaning come together and here there. So it strikes me that there's something really kind of threatening, almost surreal about those blobby texts to the two of you. And I just wondered, like, how are you navigating that breakdown, the way you emboss those builds up and breaks down, play the views around materiality. Have you found the line where where you can't read the emboss anymore? Where is that?
That's such an amazing question. And I guess I have two thoughts in response to it. And I totally agree the matter and meaning. I really feel like that conflict, like that tension is really operative in the emboss. I guess the first thing I would say is there's a French artist, Rodolfo Krasno, who undertook these really weird embosses where he just put like whole objects under pieces of paper. And I'm fascinated and obsessed with when an emboss stops being an emboss, like when, like, is Ani Albers's pierced paper, is that an emboss? Is, you know, a rubbing, when does a rubbing stop being a rubbing and start being an emboss? Like all these sort of little like cousins and relatives of the emboss process. But I guess like to me, Krasno really tests that because he understands these as embosses, but then, I mean, it's like a golf ball or like, you know, just like an object that he's just making a paper impression of. And I guess the second thing in response to your question, which Jen and I were talking about today at lunch, is there's this profound tension within the production of the emboss and the tactility that it evokes to also make it last so that the touching of it will not destroy it. So we both are really interested in the use of various kinds of like substances applied over the emboss to essentially secure it. Because on things like Valentine's cards or stationery, if you're meant to touch it and you're touching it a lot, and I know Dave, you worked on this as a problem a lot as well, that actually ruins it, right? Because there's actually not just one pressing of an emboss, but there's hundreds, because there's the pressing that makes the emboss, and there's every time that someone, that's another kind of an impression, a reincarnation of the impression.
That's such a good tack. I mean, one way is the embossments really become visible in Dickinson's work is when they get dirty. So like they're being printed, they're being soiled in essence to be seen, which I kind of love. And Thoreau's also is really like almost like a rubbing rather than like an emboss on the back of the record of flowering plants. I mean, one thing I wanted to go back to is cataloging. I think this question really comes up in library catalogs, which often, you know, there's rarely the record of what embossment is there, but when it gets cataloged, it's usually because it has language in it. And so if there's legible language like Carson's Congress, it's written into the cataloging information sometimes. But like I found it really interesting, like when I went to talk to Carolyn Vega at the Berg, she said that her conservator didn't think they had that many at the in New York Public. I thought, how could that be possible? They're just like, they're everywhere and nowhere. And that makes me love them more. That they're there and no one's seeing them. Like I get kind of like panicked to go look. But they really do, for me, verge on abstraction a lot of the time. When you're trying hard to see them, that's when they disappear. They're very fugitive to the like sense-making part. In the same way that looking at paper under the microscope was today, that you like suddenly you can't see what you're seeing anymore. I like that kind of magnitude, and yeah, it's very Dickinson, that scale shift. So I like thinking about that.
So protean too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that is a good place to end. The Freudian tips. So thank you so much for coming, for people here and abroad, and thank you to our speakers again for such a great job.
Thank you.